Hey, nostalgia. What's up? It's the Culture Detective here investigating your favorite albums. And yeah, I'm so late according to my schedule. But I still persevere because today I'm planning to do a very, very, very special mini albums review video. It is my 51st mini albums review video, but this time this is going to be interesting because this is going to be the first Pink Floyd edition of my mini albums review, meaning that I will not talk about albums from different artists. I will talk about albums from one band, and that is Pink Floyd. But of course, I will not talk about all of them because I don't have that much time. I don't want to bore you with one 4 hour long video. So I'll only cover a few early Pink Floyd albums in this video. I've already covered metal a couple days ago, so I'm only going to talk about albums before The Dark Side of the Moon on this album while skipping metal. You guys should also know that I have been waiting to do this video for a very, very, very long time because I have been a Pink Floyd fan since I was at the age of, I think, 13. I think I was around 13-ish when I started listening to Pink Floyd, and I'm already about to turn 18 soon, so Pink Floyd has been a pretty important band in my life. So starting off, they are formed in London, England, United Kingdoms in the year 1965. And they are one of the most important bands in the world because they are the pioneers, or at least one of the pioneers of progressive rock, experimental rock, art rock, alongside with, again, the Velvet Underground, the Doors, and it is the year 1967, an incredibly important year in music history because, again, the Velvet Underground and Nico, we have not Abbey Road, Sgt. Pepper, released in 1967, and I think the Doors' self-titled debut is also released in 1967, and also Pink Floyd's debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Originally, when I was 13, when I was listening to this album, I wasn't a huge fan of it because, Baroque pop, psychedelic pop rock isn't really my kind of thing. I mean, in the beginning, Pink Floyd kind of plays it safe, except they do experiment a little bit here. It's a very 60s album. It doesn't feel all that experimental, even though there are a couple of experimental tracks, but overall, generally, it's a pretty straightforward, linear, psychedelic pop rock. Maybe a little bit of folk, maybe a little bit of Baroque pop, sort of mixed together in this album. But now that I'm going back to this album is actually pretty good. I mean, a lot of the chord progressions on this album are actually quite beautiful, quite golden. The performances, they are okay. I'm not gonna say that they're like the best of all times. You would have to wait until, the big four. And the songwriting, the lyrics, they are interesting. They are some really British lyrics. Early Pink Floyd lyrics are so British, it's actually kind of hilarious. And I guess it kind of helps this album in a good way because it just makes this album feel more eccentric. I mean, just look at the album cover. So I forgot to mention that in the beginning, Pink Floyd is four members: Roger Waters, Syd Barrett, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason, the drummer. And then after they recorded their first album, Syd Barrett had to leave Pink Floyd because of mental health reasons, so David Gilmour later on joined the band. But on this album, David Gilmour is not present. And not gonna lie, there are actually a handful of pretty good songs on this album. The album opener, Astronomy, Domine, is actually a classic. A lot of people nowadays still talk about it. I mean, bands like Death Grips would sample Astronomy Domine, also later on in the album Interstellar Overdrive, but Astronomy Domine has always been easily my favorite song on the entire Piper, and it's a really spacey, weird, eccentric track that doesn't take itself too seriously, while it has some pretty fun production. And the second track, Lucifer Sam, has a slick bass line, and I also really like the track Flaming, which has a really strong, nostalgic, sunset, sort of melancholic but also psychedelic chord progression. Again, Interstellar Overdrive is a really long-winded experimental cut. And another very experimental and weird cut would be Power Doc Talk H. Power Talk H. And it's the entire track is basically the band members pretending, making noises with their mouths, and that's it. And it's not the only Pink Floyd track that does that. However, I'm still not a huge fan of the second half of the album. The second half of the album doesn't sound all that much creative to me. It's just your average, generic, Baroque, pop, folk, psychedelic, progressive rock, early 70s, late 60s stuff. And tracks like Chapter 24 and The Gnome are not necessarily all that great, especially now that I'm listening to it. It still doesn't sound all that great, but still overall I like the album. I can't give an exact score to the album, but if I have to give it one, I will give it an 8 out of 10, a really safe, light 8. Anyways, immediately afterwards, in the year 1968, they had released their second full-length studio album, and that is A Saucerful of Secrets. And this time only one track features Syd Barrett, and every other track features David Gilmour. And I actually think that this album is underrated AF. It's really, really underrated. A lot of the tracks here are actually solid. It appears that Pink Floyd, they always strive for creativity, meaning that they will always try to change their musical style on each album at least slightly. And on this album, there is a very obvious change. A lot of the tracks here sound so much more experimental. The album opening, Let There Be More Light, is fantastic in my opinion. The little guitar lick in the beginning, bum 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 bum, the way the percussion sort of match up with the bass, and then it becomes this really weird Arabic inspired line. Dun, 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 dun. It's really weird, really eccentric, especially for an album released in 1968, but it's really good. The next track, Remember a Day, is a more mellow progressive rock cut. The pianos on this thing are grim, but they are also beautiful. And the track Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is like a nearly 9-minute long experimental piece. At some points nearly ambient, at some points a cacophony of weird random bleeps, not bleeps and bloops, but more pings and pangs of instrumentals. While I don't think it's a very good sounding experimental track, I still appreciate the band for their ambition. The track Corporal Clegg sounds like the band is taking a piss. It's like they're portraying a really dumb character. And the title track, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's another really long-winded experimental track. And the next track, Seesaw, is a bit of a haze. It's a bit of a cloud. It's like your average Baroque pop folk psych rock song, but I guess without an obvious structure. And the album ends off with Jug Band Blues, which is where Syd Barrett comes on. And it sounds like the most British song ever. It just sounds like and if you look at the lyrics, it's so British. Like, no one else in the world who speaks English would speak like that, other than in the UK. Anyways, if I could give this album a score, it'll be a strong 7 to a light 8 as well. The third full-length studio album they released is actually a soundtrack to the film More. And this is the first Pink Floyd album that is just mediocre in my opinion. There's really nothing special about this album. I mean, there are a lot of instrumental cuts on this album, and it's not that they're all that experimental or anything, because, I mean, it's for a film, so they can't really do anything, and they're not necessarily all that special. The sound play isn't really all that out there or innovative in comparison to the two previous Pink Floyd projects. Second of all, the songs themselves, they are not really all that memorable either. We have tracks like Green is the Color, which is this really quiet, mellow cut, and the track Cymbaline, which are two tracks that I think are decent. But other than that, every single other track is just okay. The track Ibiza Bar is a bit of a guitar jam, but without any personality or anything memorable to it. The main theme is this really sparse, underwhelming theme, and the dramatic theme at the end of the album isn't really all that dramatic, so truth be told, but More is 5 out of 10 for me. And then we have the fourth album, and it looks like they are venturing off to an even more experimental and strange direction. The fourth album is Ummagumma. I absolutely love the album cover. It's genius. But, the music on the album itself is, What? I think this is the point where they have gone too far. They have tried too hard to go experimental. They have gone too far. It is, I think, 1969, the same year they released More. I guess you can say that they didn't have enough time to write fully written, completed songs. But still, a bulk of Ummagumma is just confusing and head-scratching. I mean, I love experimental music, but when it's so half-baked and underwritten, it's more confusing than it is impressive. We have Sisyphus, parts 1, 2, 4. Literally, we have a track called Sisyphus Part 1, and then Part 2, and then Part 3, and then Part 4. 4 separate tracks. And it's just okay. Every single track is this very thin layer of instrumental that doesn't really do much. The track Grantchester Meadows is a really long-winded folk cut. Psychedelic folk cut. It's very mellow, very quiet. Instrumentally, it is thin, and it drags. Then we have an extremely weird track. Several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pick. That is the name of the song. And it is like a 11-minute long track where, again, the entire band, all 4 of the members, just make weird noises, just clapping like bird wings clapping, and they would do ee-ee-ah to pretend to be monkeys and birds and different animals. It's a really weird track, and it doesn't really do much musically. If I could say anything, I admire the band for being this ambitious, but I'm just not a huge fan of it. The next 3 tracks is the Narrow Way, parts 1, 2, 3, and I guess it's the best track here. The best track on this album, in my opinion, is the Narrow Way Part 1. Because it actually has a clear structure. It's a very simple guitar piece, but it does feel very nice and crisp. The other 2, the Narrow Way tracks, didn't really do much either. There are a couple of good instrumental moments here and there, but overall it's just one weird experimental mess. And then we have the Grand Vizier's Garden Party. Parts 1 and 3 are the entrance and exit, and it's these very short flute passages, like about 1 minute long, and then the part two, the second part of this track, is this 7 minute long weird percussion showcase where we get these hand drums and these bongos and all sorts of percussion sort of circling around. And in a way, again, musically, I'm not a huge fan of it, but I actually kind of like for what it stands, because in a way, it almost sounds like I got lost in a forbidden part in Disneyland, and I entered this really weird, fantastical, mystical land where some old creature is banging the drums and performing a magical ritual of sorts. It actually gives me some pretty interesting vibes. But yeah, that's all I could say for Ummagumma. It is a 5 out of 10 as well. Strong 4 to a light 5. Easily my least favorite album from Pink Floyd. Up next we have Atom Heart Mother, and it is so underrated. In my opinion, it's just as good as Metal. This is the point where Pink Floyd starts to get psychedelic instead of experimental. They venture off to a new direction. First of all, the title track is a 23-minute long instrumental piece, and it's multifaceted. There are parts on the track where it's very beautiful piano passages. There are a few guitar solos on this track that are very trippy, dizzying, sweet, but yet drunken and psychedelic again. And there are horns on this track. There are bits and pieces of sound effects sprinkled all over the track, and there are moments where it's just quiet down to a point of near ambient. I actually kind of like the track overall. The tracks If and Summer 68 are two very sweet, mellow ballads that are actually well written. It's solid, it's cohesive, it has a clear structure, yet it doesn't sound like your average, psychedelic folk either. The track Fat Old Sun is a very beautiful cut. It's very quiet and it's very slow, but there's something really nostalgic and golden about it that I love. And the last track, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, is the one track that just gets on my nerves. I don't know why, but this is a 12-minute long experimental track once again. And at around the 5th minute mark, you could literally hear Alan eat his breakfast. The chewing sounds, the fork and the knife scratching the plate. Ugh, why? I don't know whose idea is that, but every time I listen to an album, I do not want to hear people chewing and sort of forks and knives scratching the plate. I don't want to hear that. Just shut it off. But that's my only complaint on the album. It's still a really good album overall. Strong 8 to a light 9. Anyways, they released Metal in the year 1971. 1970 is Atom Heart Mother. 1971 is Metal. And 1972 is Obscured by Clouds. And 1973 is The Dark Side of the Moon. And 1972's Obscured by Clouds is also an album made for a film. Except this one is so much better. It's so much better. Wow. This is the precursor to The Dark Side of the Moon. You can tell. I mean, instrumentally, it is so well produced. The instrumentals are so dense and so solid and cohesive. There are the keyboards, the guitars, the drums, the vocals. They're mixed so well together. They're so homogeneous. And there are actually fully written completed tracks on this thing that doesn't have the demo quality to it, but actually it feels official. And yeah, I actually enjoy pretty much every single track on this album. I can't find one track that rubs me the wrong way. There are, of course, a few duds here and there that are duds simply because they're relatively not as, interesting sounding, but still, we have guitar jams like When You're In and The Gold, It's in the, and we have very beautiful piano ballads like Mudman and Burning Bridges. The track Childhood's End is also a highlight, and What's the Deal is a very beautiful guitar ballad. And even though, again, there is nothing all that experimental or innovative about Obscured by Clouds, I still think it is a very, very solid album. It doesn't break any new ground, but I think instrumentally, performance-wise, I think the band is slowly reaching the peak of their careers, which is true. And you can tell by the really well written chord progressions and the very nice poetic lyrics, and yeah, it's just criminally underrated. So yeah, if I could give this a score, I would give this like a strong 8 to a light 9, I guess, as well. I mean, it's just really good, or at least a strong 8. Same goes for Atom Heart Mother. I would actually put Atom Heart Mother in a light 9 as well. But yeah, I will talk about The Dark Side of the Moon very soon. I will also talk about the latest KSI, Perfume Genius, Natalia Lafourcade, Freddie Gibson, The Alchemist, Backwash, Run the Jewels, and Proto Martyr, and Jeff Rosenstock very soon. Thanks for watching.